You wake up to screaming, not in Kabul, not in Caracas, in Birmingham. Police stopped answering 2 days ago. A government building is on fire. No arrests, no coverage. Your neighbor has been jailed for a tweet. A mosque was torched last night. Revenge, they said. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is silent. Parliament hides behind barricades. And you? You're wondering if it's time to leave. This isn't a war zone, it's Britain, and it's breaking apart. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on a chilling truth. Civil conflict is no longer a fringe conspiracy. It's being discussed in government meetings, war rooms, and academic circles. We'll break down how mass immigration, failed integration, rising crime, political betrayal, and Orwellian censorship are setting the stage for something Britain hasn't seen in nearly 400 years. Civil war. We'll look at the real numbers behind the immigration surge, how grooming gangs got cover while mothers got prison time, and what experts say could be the spark that ignites it all. And most importantly, can any of this still be stopped? Modern Britain is a huge paradox. It's the country most responsible for creating the world as we know it. The rights a lot of us take for granted, or hope that we should have, like freedom of speech, religion, and even the expectation that we get to regularly elect our leaders, all began here. They were exported through the empire the sun was never supposed to set on. But then the sun set on the empire, and might not even stop there. When you think of a failed state, you think of a place like Zimbabwe, or perhaps Mexico. Criminals run rampant, and trust in public institutions is rarer than a blue rose. You wouldn't think of a first world democracy like Britain, but that's where it's heading. But civil war, really? Maybe you should first ask yourself, how do civil wars start? It's a trick question. Each case is unique. But David Betts, a professor of war in the modern world at King's College London, has noticed a pattern in a lot of them. If you, your regime, have legitimacy, you have no insurgent problem. If you don't, you're very likely to have an insurgent problem. His words call to mind the civil wars that raged in Liberia between 1989 and 2003. Even though it was founded by people freed from slavery in the United States, Liberia never became an American-style democracy. But it was a relatively stable oligarchy. Then the corruption and soaring poverty got too much to handle, and the country began to come apart. Okay, so maybe that's a stretch for now, but the trend hasn't been Britain's friend. In 2024, 45% of Britons said they almost never trust the government to act in the national interest. And what's one of the reasons for that? Like most things, it's the economy. While the United States bounced back from the pandemic relatively smoothly, Britain has been mired in slow growth. Between 2020 and 2024, the United States economy grew by about 3% a year. The United Kingdom's GDP growth in 2024 was only 1.1%. Those aren't just numbers on the World Bank spreadsheet. They make a huge difference in people's standard of living. The Center for Research and Social Policy, an organization that monitors poverty, disposable income, and living standards, had a grim picture for Britain in 2025. This year, it announced that a third of the UK's people, 24 million, were now living below the minimum income standard. That's the worst number since it started keeping track in 1983. This problem wasn't sudden, though. Parts of Britain have long resembled the Rust Belt in the United States, with left-behind former industrial communities. It's especially the case in northern England, and you can see it in the numbers. In 2023, the GDP per capita of northeastern England was £28,583. In the southeast, it was 1.4 times higher, £41,319. Some people say that northern England feels more like the economy of an Eastern European country than one of the world's leading economic centers. In fact, one of those Eastern European countries is set to overtake Britain. A lot of people that came to Britain in the last 30 years have been Polish. They arrived after their country joined the European Union in 2004, but they're now going home in search of better opportunities. That's because the Polish economy grew by an astounding 316% between 1995 and 2024. By 2030, the IMF predicts that its GDP per capita will actually surpass the United Kingdom's. They're surging ahead. The UK is being left behind. The Conservative Party that ruled the country between 2010 and 2024 promised they would do something about this. Leveling up, they called it. There was even a whole department for it, with a minister and everything. But the politicians fell short of the goal. So short that one of the first things Keir Starmer's Labour government did was abolish the phrase. It's now known as local government in the Ministry of Housing, Communities, and Local Government. It makes sense for Labour to not associate itself with a phrase that now stands for broken promises. We've seen this before. When the economy isn't doing so hot, tensions tend to rise high and people get jaded about the world. So Britain's responses are natural. They don't trust each other the way they used to. A third of young people in the UK now think that they can't trust most people, let alone their government. This would be bad enough under normal circumstances, but in Britain, there's another element that makes it an especially dangerous formula. 62% of all Britons think that their country is becoming more divided. That's partially because of the floundering economy. But there's another much more controversial tension that's been erupting more and more intensely over the last few years. A lot of British people say they don't recognize their country anymore, and that's more than just a figment of those people's imaginations. The UK is experiencing an unprecedented wave of migration. Before we get into the numbers, please consider subscribing. It helps us to keep making videos like this and talk about things your nightly news broadcasts won't say. Now to the charts. They're damning. Between 2001 and 2021, the foreign-born population in England and Wales doubled, from 8.8% to 16.8%. And like a snowball rolling downhill, it's going faster and getting bigger. In 2011, 7.5 million people were born overseas. Net migration hit a record in 2022. 1.26 million people came in and 493,000 moved out, leaving a surplus of 764,000. But here's what might be the most astonishing number. 1 in every 25 people in the UK today came during just the last 4 years. So much, so fast, and it's creating a rebound effect on the economy. The inward flow of new people means more need to fit into the same geographical space, but housing hasn't been keeping up with the soaring demand. In 1999, the average home price in the UK was £74,638. 5 years later, it was £152,464. But the increase had only begun. By December 2015, the price had risen to £197,044. 10 years later, it's £269,000. And what's a typical income in Britain? The median average for a full-time worker is £37,430. That's only about a 30% increase from the £26,095 the typical British worker was making just before the 7.5 million newcomers started to arrive. Things might not be quite as bleak as that. The mean average salary is £45,836. Higher, but still not nearly enough to put housing within reach of a lot of workers. Little wonder why the unaffordability of housing is one of the biggest complaints that people in Britain have, especially younger ones. It's hard to start an independent life, let alone a family, if you have to compete with millions of people from overseas for a limited supply of housing. Meanwhile, the government spent £3 billion on hotels for asylum seekers between 2023 and 2024 alone. That just makes people feel like they're being forced to give up their hard-earned money for a government that favors foreigners over them. The pace of immigration and pressure on housing would be a challenging problem for Britain to navigate if that was all there was to it. But that's not all there is to it. Where the newcomers are coming from is as important as how many there are. There's a huge irony about the 2016 Brexit vote. Britons voted to leave the European Union in no small part because of what they were seeing during the height of the migrant crisis the year before. Over 1 million refugees and irregular migrants moved into Europe, overwhelming many countries. But fate is full of irony. Ever since Brexit, immigration to the UK has increased, and the majority of the new arrivals are now from cultures much different than Britain's. In 2023, 250,000 people came from India, 141,000 more from Nigeria, 90,000 were from China, 83,000 from Pakistan, and 36,000 from Zimbabwe. There were smaller numbers from Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Eritrea, Somalia, and Sudan. who came as asylum seekers. In practice, a lot of them would have their claims rejected, but once they're in, it's much harder to get them out. So many people have come so fast that this isn't just a housing problem, it's creating a far bigger one. Britons feel like strangers in a strange land because integration isn't keeping pace with immigration. And that feeling hit hard during one of the worst crimes in modern British history. On July 29, 2024, 17-year-old Axel Rudakabana went on a stabbing spree, targeting the most vulnerable people in Southport. By the time it was over, 3 girls between the ages of 6 and 9 were killed. An additional 10 were injured, 8 more children, and 2 adults. They were just trying to enjoy themselves at a Taylor Swift-themed dance event. A protest and then a riot broke out. It was the worst unrest Britain saw in a decade. Hotels hosting asylum seekers and mosques came under attack. Rudakabana was born in Britain, but that didn't stop the critics. His parents came from Rwanda in 2002. To be fair, Rudakabana was likely just a deranged madman, not much different from deranged madmen in Britain or anywhere else. He had a fascination with the violent acts of Genghis Khan, Hitler, and the genocide in Rwanda. He wasn't an immigrant, and his crime wasn't ideological. But it didn't make the critics ease off because they're jaded. They might have had a good reason to jump to conclusions in this case. Most immigrants, legal or not, are law-abiding, but foreign nationals make up a disproportionate share of the people in British prisons. Over 12% of prisoners in the UK are foreign nationals. As of December 2023, there were 10,423 of them being held in custody, although they probably don't come from where many people think they do. 13% of them are Albanian, 9% are Polish, 7% are Romanian, 6% are Irish, and 4% are Jamaican. The Albanians aren't a coincidence, though. As they've come into the UK, gangs involved in drugs and human trafficking have come with them. Their rise is part of an unpleasant fact of modern migration patterns. The people crossing the English Channel in small boats? There's not a lot of gender equality among them. 90% of the people coming to the UK in this way between 2018 and 2021 were male. It's a little better now. By that, we mean there were only around 76% adult males arriving in 2024. You can probably guess what sort of problems this creates. The critics also say that because the number of immigrants is so high, Britain doesn't resemble one country anymore, but many sharing the same space. Parallel communities have been set up where people can live, work, and enjoy themselves without ever having to interact with broader British society. But is this just a feeling? Fortunately, there's an interactive map from the Office for National Statistics. It shows that ethnic minorities tend to heavily concentrate in certain areas. For example, there are large parts of Leicester and East London heavily dominated by South Asian immigrants and their children. In parts of Birmingham, African communities are dominant. This isn't just a geographical curiosity, though. It can have a heavy influence on local law and law enforcement. There are about 4 million Muslims in Britain that have very conservative interpretations of their religion. So now there's Sharia councils in parts of the UK. In 2018, an independent review from the Home Office estimated that there were between 30 and 85 of them in England and Wales, although it could be more or less. The data isn't easy to keep track of, but they're there, and they're contributing to trust issues between Muslims and non-Muslims in the UK. And there's no worse scandal that exposes this than the one that happened in Rotherham. Between the 1980s and 2013, organized criminal groups of primarily Pakistani men abused up to 1,400 young girls. The victims were primarily from working-class English families, although some British Asian girls were also being targeted. The girls were sexually assaulted and even trafficked into prostitution. But the worst thing, at least as far as this topic goes, is that the authorities had a clue about what was going on, but turned a blind eye to it because they were afraid they'd get racism accusations if they intervened. And many of the perpetrators got off with slaps on the wrist. In one case, 4 members of the grooming gang were given sentences of 6 to 10 years behind bars. And that has led to even more mistrust. It fuels the perception that Pakistani grooming gangs are protected, while the white working class can't even voice its opinion without getting thrown in the slammer. Which brings us to possibly the most important aspect of what can cause civil war. Civil wars don't happen at random. Usually, they come from the failure of multiple pressure valves. In theory, the British have led the way in creating that system of pressure valves by guaranteeing regular elections to Parliament and freedom of speech to ensure that debate remained open. But these things have been steadily closing off. Just ask Hamid Koskin. In June, he was convicted and fined £240. His crime? He burned the Koran during a public protest outside the Turkish embassy. So much for freedom of speech. Oh, but it gets worse. During the incident, he was assaulted by a knife-wielding attacker. Fortunately, he wasn't seriously injured, but he was spat on and kicked for burning the book. But so far, at least, the attacker hasn't been charged. Only Koskin. The incident led the National Secular Society to issue a warning. By doing things like this, Britain is effectively going back to something out of the 17th century. It's imposing blasphemy laws for the benefit of one community over the majority of the country. And it even tolerates assault for the benefit of that community. But that's far from the end of it. Remember the rampage by the criminal that attacked those little girls? There were other arrests, but none of them were rioters. During the chaos, a 41-year-old mom and wife of a former Conservative politician named Lucy Connolly posted an inflammatory message on X. She called for mass deportations. But then the message got worse, saying that hotels full of illegal immigrants should be burned. She deleted the tweet after it got 300,000 views, but still got arrested. That makes sense. You can't expect to be able to get away with incitement or making violent threats. Even so, her sentence raised eyebrows. It was 2.5 years in prison under the charge of inciting racial hatred. Lucy Connolly had no criminal record, so it seemed harsh, especially when members of a grooming gang in Telford got lesser sentences despite being convicted of sexually abusing children. Lucy Connolly still committed a criminal act, though, at least. Other police visits in Britain can only be described as bizarre. 2 years ago, a man in Yorkshire was arrested. Why? Because he posted a meme on Facebook combining a swastika with a transgender flag. To them, that was a hate crime. Police have even investigated people for non-hate crime incidents, where they get warnings on their record for posting remarks called offensive, but not quite criminal. Meanwhile, in some parts of Britain, organized shoplifting gangs operate with brazen openness. So naturally, people think that the government prefers to police tweets than the streets. With a two-tier system of justice where sentences favor ethnic or religious minorities. And that might not just be a figment of their imaginations. The sentencing guidelines say that judges should get reports about an offender's background before handing out punishment to a minority. This April, the Labour government's own Secretary of State for Justice at the time, Shabana Mahmood, had to review Britain's sentencing guidelines under pressure. So when does this volcano erupt? And what kind of an eruption are we looking at? The riots after last year's murder spree suggest it might not take much for wider unrest to come. Some experts are afraid that if a terrorist attack like the 2005 London train bombings happened again, Britain would tip over the edge, because the sense of unease is stronger now. People are more isolated, less hopeful about the future, and less trusting of the government. Betts says that he wouldn't expect to see anything like the battles of Britain's 17th century Civil War. More like a messy and fragmented insurgency, with attackers targeting critical infrastructure that doesn't have much more protection than a fence. Political figures and judges might also be targeted. Then disorder will run rampant, especially with the police under stress and the army at its smallest size since the 18th century. Think of it like the Balkans, or more ironically, Ulster at its worst. That's why some people call it the Ulsterification of Britain. Sure, it sounds a little extreme, and even the people most afraid of it are saying it's not inevitable. The controversial Dominic Cummings, who was Boris Johnson's lead advisor, says Britain is in a pre-revolutionary state. By electing a reformist government that will seriously tackle the issues of the cost of living, immigration, crime, and corruption, unrest could be prevented. But he says that if the current state of affairs continues into the 2030s, serious violence will be hard to avoid. With riots breaking out so easily after a politically charged murder, we can at least say that's plausible. It doesn't take a full-blown civil war to cause serious chaos. But what do you think? Is Britain standing on the edge of a cliff? Let us know in the comments.